So yeah, guys, if you saw my Instagram post, I gave like a little preview of some things we're going to be covering. Some of these were on Instagram. Dave Fretz, what's up, man? Thank you for watching. Some of these were requests on Instagram. Some of these are just current events that are important and obviously on the agenda for everyone in the news, or maybe they're not on the news enough, which is why I feel like they need to be discussed. But the first thing I think it's important to talk about is the Ohio train derailment. Okay. So the biggest thing about this is, guys, allegedly, this was something that they were trying to like suppress, not really put into the media a lot. There was a journalist arrested for going to cover some of the town hall meeting back in like the beginning of this situation. Now, it did come out that he was arrested for like trespassing or something and then released with no charges, but it's just the fact that a journalist was even detained is like a big, huge red flag. Like that's something that is very touchy, especially in democracy, about putting like a journalist behind bars. For the most part, for trespassing, you have to be warned once. So you can't just be trespassing your first time somewhere. I know in New York, you have to be put on notice for trespass. So like, for example, like in Manhattan, if you're walking and you happen to walk onto someone's property unintentionally, you can't be arrested for trespass. You have to be put on notice first. Like, hey, you're on my property. If you return, you'll be trespassed. Then you could be charged with trespassing. So regardless, there was a journalist detained, arrested, released with no charges for covering something about the Ohio train derailment. So for those of people who might not be familiar, I'll give you a quick recap. So February 3rd, the freight train derails in East Palestine, Ohio. Guys, keep in mind, you're going to see in the news, it's continually referred to as East Palestine, Ohio. I'm going to explain a point about that later. February 4th, the next day, the EPA begins monitoring the air for vinyl chloride and butyl acrylate. So those are the chemicals that they were monitoring for. Okay. February 5th, the governor issues a shelter in place for 5,000 people to evacuate within 1 mile of the crash radius. Okay. So that 1 mile is going to be important later when we talk about the town hall meeting. Now, February 6th, this 3 days later, Norfolk Southern, which is the freight train company, launches a controlled burn of the train cars. So they proactively begin to burn the toxins, chemicals, whatever you want to call them, in the train cars. And guys, this isn't something that's nefarious. Controlled burns are something that are done proactively sometimes to avoid like an explosion. But from things that I've read and heard online and from like other people, is if you notice how black the burn was, that's indication that the burn was done with too little oxygen. Almost like if your car is running and there's black smoke, it means there's not enough oxygen in the mixture of what's coming out. So the fact that it was super black is concerning. But regardless, the burn is releasing vinyl chloride into the atmosphere above where people are living. So the controlled burn happens, and residents immediately start reporting the odor of chemicals, headaches. One woman reported her son waking up convulsing at the moment that she started smelling this odor. Pets dying that were outside, fish dying, frogs dying in the water. And what a lot of us have seen, the chemical gloss over the water in the area. So like, I'm sure if you haven't seen the videos of the water there's this weird, like glossy, like rainbowy, oil, chemical, something in the water. So this all happens, and the residents of East Palestine essentially force the representatives and Mayor Trent Conaway and the EPA to attend a big town hall to address the concerns. So thankfully, those people in East Palestine didn't just like go with the flow and take what the answers they were getting from, the EPA, and they said, listen, you guys need to come down here and address our concerns. one issue that was brought up in that town hall meeting was that residents outside of that 1 mile radius are being affected by the chemicals, but because they're not geographically labeled inside of that radius, they're not receiving aid. So obviously this like chemical cloud or chemical whatever you want to call it is spreading. It's not just like in a balloon. So it's spreading further than a 1 mile radius. People are getting affected, and apparently they aren't receiving aid because they don't technically, qualify within the 1 mile radius. Now, Norfolk Southern was supposed to attend that town hall meeting to answer to the residents of East Palestine, and they canceled last minute, citing that they were concerned for their safety. So they never attended the town hall meeting. What they did do was they sent independent contractors. So these are independent contractors, not from the government. These are hired by Norfolk Southern to check homes, okay, and have them cleared if they're safe or not. So far they've cleared 550 homes in East Palestine as technically safe to return to. Now, the video I saw, the woman has a 9-year-old or 9-month-old. She was inside the home with these contractors, and she had a mask on. They didn't, and she was saying, I can't return here. The smell, I'm getting a headache. I'm getting dizzy. She had to wait outside. The contractors had some kind of like a air testing machine. It looked like the box that they catch ghosts from in Ghostbusters, but they were waving it around or whatever. They showed her an invoice, right, that showed that the house was cleared. They gave her a copy. And she said, what do you attribute that smell to if the air is technically clean based on your machine? And the independent contractor basically didn't have an answer for her. He couldn't cite what that smell was in her home. And she was saying she was dizzy, and she's essentially now living 20 miles away from her hometown in a hotel because she can't return to her house. So there was an interview with James Fabisiak. He's a professor of environmental and occupational health from the University of Pittsburgh. Okay, guys, Pittsburgh is going to be important because if you look at the map, right, so this keeps being referred to as East Palestine, East Palestine, East Palestine. They're not mentioning what's really close to where this train derailment was. If you pull up Google Maps East Palestine, essentially it's about 25 to 40 minutes from Pittsburgh. So this isn't like some far away accident that happened in some kind of like desolate area. This is 25 to 30, 40 minutes from Pittsburgh, which is a hugely populated area. And who's to say it's not going to continue spreading? So this professor was asked, if this happened to you, would you return to the town? And he said, absolutely not. He said, the issue is not so much what's in the air, but he said the question people need to ask is what chemicals are left in the ground? Because depending on what chemicals are left in the ground, they may migrate over time to, let's say, a water well, a water supply. Will that chemical be in the ground where kids might be playing? So he said if it was on him, he definitely would not return to that area unless he knew what the chemical was. So the big takeaway is that the residents and the public need to know what the chemicals are that may be in the ground or may not, and then they can decide if those chemicals are safe to be around based on long-term effects that they know about those chemicals. So at the moment, they don't know what if any chemicals are left on the ground. Okay, guys, think about if this is something you're seeing on like news, radio. For the most part, I see it a lot on social media, but not so much on the news, and that makes you think like why or how is it not being covered a lot, right? That means that there's some kind of a power imbalance that allows maybe this train company or elected officials to stop that information from being broadcast widely for people to know. From what I've read and heard is thankfully for Twitter, that information was able to spread quick, so they had to address it. Otherwise, it was being heavily suppressed on the news media. So that's the train derailment. The other request I had was to review the myplate.gov website. So, guys, anything that's sent to me, I'm taking the time to look into it. Okay, so the narrative was about talking about how this My Plate was comparing cereal nutrients to meat and claiming that they were similar in nutrition. So I went to check on the website. I haven't been able to find any kind of a claim like that. Based on the website, it's myplate.gov. It's run by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Okay, I just skimmed through basically like all the different categories of food. They have it split up: fruits, vegetables, grains, protein foods, and dairy. I didn't see anything here really that nefarious or like of concern, but there was a few things that I found interesting. So, I mean, I'll just go through this live with you guys. This is berries. They have fruit juice on here, 100% fruit juice. So, melons and other fruits. Okay. Now, when we get to the vegetable group, okay, this is pretty self-explanatory. There were a few things I saw in the greens and dairy section that I wanted to mention, though. Beans, peas, and lentils are labeled as vegetables and a protein source. That's one thing that I will say, that this website claims that if you're a vegan or a vegetarian, that you can use the beans, peas, and lentils as a protein source. What they don't mention is that the amount of beans, peas, and lentils that you might need to eat to get the same amount of protein as like a meat or a poultry source is highly, it's just like massive amounts of beans and lentils that you would need to eat to get the same amount of protein from vegetables. But the grains group, so the grains groups, it's split up between whole grains and refined grains. So there was a few things that caught my eye here. Whole grains, they have popcorn listed as one of the choices for a whole grain. They have where was that? Maybe it's in the refined grains. So these are refined grains. These products are usually made from refined grains, but some may also be made with whole grains. Check the ingredient list, blah, blah, blah. So these are the recommended not serving sizes, but the recommended choices for refined grains for your daily diet. Bagels, challah bread, 10p, J Duggle, High Valley. What's up, brother? Cornbread, ramen noodles. Guys, ramen noodles are probably one of the most, I don't even consider that food, even if you take that disgusting pack of whatever out. Pizza crust is listed as a refined grain. Pancakes, English muffins, capital E English muffins, so that specific brand. Cookies are listed as a refined grain. Cornflakes, matzo, waffles, pretzels, pie and pastry crusts, naan, French bread, and cakes. So these are all recommendations to get your daily dose of refined grains by the Department of Agriculture. Now the protein food, we have meats, beef, goat, ham, lamb, and pork. I'm not sure why they distinguish a difference between ham and pork, because ham is just a processed form of pork that really wouldn't be considered a meat. That would be more of a processed pork. They have deli meats as a form of protein. So beef, chicken, ham, pork, and turkey, deli meats. Game meats, okay, they have raccoon, squirrel, and opossum on there. So that's good to go. And they do have organ meats on there: brain, heart, sweetbreads, chitterlings, kidney, tongue, giblets, liver, tripe, gizzard, and stomach. Poultry, they don't really mention anything about organic. They have chicken. Seafood, they do recommend not eating too much of the ones that are high in mercury, but there are some good recommendations here for seafood. Eggs, chicken or duck eggs, nuts and seeds. Beans, peas, and lentils, again, are mentioned in the protein section, and then soy products are mentioned in the protein section. Tempeh, which I don't know what that is. Texturized vegetable protein, TVP, tofu, and veggie burgers. Now, when you go to the dairy group, they specifically, so milk, they have milk, non-dairy calcium alternatives, soy milk, yogurt, okay, kefir, which that's a good one for probiotics. And then if you go into the cheeses, they actually recommend processed cheeses, American, queso blanco, queso fresco. So yeah, guys, I thought I'd find some more like surprising things on this website. You know, I know we've seen those videos about like the fake meat and saying that eggs are bad. I didn't find it. If you guys do find a source that does claim that, send it to me on Instagram, and I'll definitely like take a look at it and read about it. But for the next, portion of this podcast, we're going to look at the Russia and Ukraine conflict, war. I don't know what it's like officially being mentioned as. Last week was officially a year in the war in Ukraine. And I think it's really important to mention some things in the history of the Russia and Ukraine, let's say, like relationship that might bring a little bit of light to why it kind of like boiled over now. So like for the most part, I think right now the media just basically covers it pretty simply. Putin is this crazy madman who's trying to take over the whole world, and Ukraine is the like hero who's fighting back. Guys, let's be honest. This is like, I think this was a good, I forget who mentioned it in this way. This is Patrick Bet-David on his podcast. He mentioned that this is essentially a proxy war between, the US and Britain and Russia, with Ukraine as the proxy, because this isn't Ukraine versus Russia if Ukraine is being helped by the United States and the UK. And this isn't just Russia when Russia is being helped by China and Iran. So it's essentially turning into a proxy World War III. All the big names are involved. I mean, this is like scary stuff. Like, this is like the one thing you don't want to happen. And this has been for years and years and years since the Cold War and before. The one thing you don't want to happen is for Russia and the US to engage or start some kind of a nuclear war, because then that just becomes, two world powers destroying the world, right? So there's always been understanding to try to avoid that kind of a conflict. And what I'm going to talk about actually is that conflict was being resolved, and the UK actually stopped that conflict from being resolved. And this was like over almost a year ago that this could have been Russia out of the Ukraine and done. So I think the one important point of reference to start is in 1997. So this is when all the tensions and stuff started with NATO. Okay. So whether it was Russia or Soviet Union who had those tensions with NATO, building up countries with like military capabilities close to Russia, both sides agreed that those tensions were there and those concerns, because in 1997 they had the NATO and Russia Founding Act. Okay. This was an agreement stating that NATO and Russia were not adversaries. So for them to come to this agreement, they obviously were acknowledging that there was some kind of like a tension or adversarial like vibe there. Okay. Boris Yeltsin, who was Russia's first president, so from Soviet Union to Russia, the first president of Russia, in 1993, he wrote a letter to President Clinton, and he said, "The spirit of the treaty on the final settlement precludes the option of expanding the NATO zone into the east." So in 1993, he was explaining to President Clinton that this treaty essentially should state that NATO is going to agree to not move any further. So NATO was kind of like, I think, halfway into Germany at this point. And Russia's expectation was that they would not continue moving east towards Russia. Okay. So you have to understand what Russia's concern is, right? If the United States saw Russia occupying countries in South America with military capabilities, there would be a concern there. And as they got closer to Mexico, they would address that concern. And if Russia started putting military occupation at the border near Mexico, that would be a huge red line and a huge boundary for the United States. Russia is essentially saying the same thing. Like, hey, NATO is moving they're adding countries to their collective that have military capabilities, and they're getting closer and closer to Russia. So keep in mind, obviously, Russia is like a static mass of land. They are where they are. NATO is moving towards Russia. Okay, so remember that when you hear these narratives about Russia being the aggressor, Russia is where Russia is. NATO is slowly moving closer to Russia and now in Ukraine. So the closest they can get before going inside Russia. So just imagine a country that has the capability to shoot a nuke or a missile into the United States. How close would you want that occupation to be? So that's the main concern here. So the aggression that Russia sees is every time NATO moves closer east, that is an aggression towards Russia, right? Because Russia is not part of NATO. So that was in 1997, 1993, the concern was brought up. So whether or not it was official or legal, Russia had this concern since the early 90s. NATO has since expanded east consistently. 2 years after that agreement was made was NATO's largest expansion in history. So right after that, they started adding more and more countries east. Okay. So like I said, Russia is not moving into these countries. NATO is adding these countries to their group and moving closer to Russia. Now, just to be clear, I'm not going to ever justify like Russia started waging war on Ukraine, okay? War is not good for anyone, okay? My grandfather was a CB in the Korean War. He served. And as he got older, he told me he was a pacifist. So he was against war. War is obviously not good for anyone. So I'm just giving you guys some timeline points to better understand like why this conflict happened and not just think like, oh, bad Russian invades country like madman. No, like this has been something that has been being built for like, 20, 25 years. So in 2014, a really important thing that happened was a coup, which means basically like another country getting involved in the politics of Ukraine. Okay, there's been coups like Cuba, all different Central American countries, and usually the U.S. is involved somehow, obviously allegedly, but there's a really good documentary on this. It's called Ukraine on Fire or Ukraine Under Fire. Basically, what happened was the president at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, rejected a deal to join the European Union. Okay, so there was an option to get Ukraine into the European Union, and he rejected that deal. Essentially or allegedly because he was being encouraged to go with NATO instead of the European Union. When he declined the deal to join the EU, there were mass protests. And guys, I'm not talking about like the protests that we're used to, that people go out for like the afternoon and hold signs. I'm talking people in Ukraine who occupied an entire city place. It was a famous area in Ukraine for months and months and months and months in cold weather, outdoors, protesting 24/7, constantly protesting. Now, guys, this is like a really long story, right? Because they were out there for months. There were fights, shootings, engagements, shooting back and forth. I mean, like Vladimir Klitschko was there because he was the mayor of Kiev. This is just a crazy story. But to make a long story short, this president who declined the deal with the EU actually ended up having to flee the country because he was basically being outed by the people because of his decision to not join the EU. You have to remember the Ukrainian people are basically, they're a young country, right? But they always have been fighting for their independence and for the next generation. So they were not going to back down. I mean, if you watch this documentary, they're in the snow getting shot at. They're being hosed down. There's video document of hired military, let's say mercenaries, to try to enforce them to leave because the Ukrainian like police and army couldn't do it. And at one point in the documentary, they show some basically there were snipers around the area that started shooting and there were two sides of this protest, right? But the shooting was coming from at both sides, essentially like encouraging the two to fight. Yeah, it's scary, guys. And these shootings happened after the U.S. officials had flown in to kind of try to talk to Ukraine and figure out how they could help. So you could take that however you want. But after this president was outed, they put in a new president who was more Western friendly, basically handpicked by maybe the U.S. and the U.K. That was not Zelensky. This is back in 2014. Now, another thing you might hear about or not hear about is Putin's claim that he wanted to denazify Ukraine. So where does this claim come from? Some will claim that this is propaganda, that this is a classic like Russian technique. The Russians have always been against, originally it was Stalin taking out the Nazis. This is not propaganda. So I'm going to share some facts with you guys about Nazism in Ukraine. So the most recent group is called the Azov Regiment. So this is a group of Ukrainian neo-Nazi white supremacists. Okay, they had a regiment. They flew the swastika-esque flag. So I won't say it's the same flag, but if you look into the Azov Regiment, you'll see the flags they use, just the hand gestures they make. They're pretty open about being neo-Nazi and white supremacists. Now, you look at that and you say, okay, where did this influence come from? Okay, is it a European thing? Is it a Ukrainian thing? Is it a lie? Okay, let's say the Azov Regiment is a lie. It's propaganda. This is Putin making it up. Now, if you go back to 1943, you find out that Ukraine actually proactively, voluntarily made their own Nazi regiment in 1943 when the Nazis were moving through Europe. So if you look up the SS Galicia, this was a group that was formed in Ukraine, and they were basically a Nazi group under Germans' control inside Ukraine. This wasn't a prisoner of war group. This wasn't a group that was forced into war. This was a Nazi group that proactively banded together and supported the Nazis, SS Galicia. Members of that group are constantly being glorified in Ukraine to this day. Okay, now what happened to these neo-Nazis? And this is, you can verify online. In May, these neo-Nazis, essentially, and this is, you guys can verify this, they were absorbed into the Ukrainian military and given their own battalion. Okay, so Ukraine did not jail these Nazis. Ukraine did not arrest them or tell them that, this is not what Ukraine supports. They absorbed them into the military and gave them their own regiment. So those Azov Regiment are currently in the Ukrainian army, and Ukraine even addressed this concern. I think there were 13,000 that got absorbed, and they claimed that only a small percentage of them were radical, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, why is that important? You have to think about the history of, how do I put this? The history of funding the next fear-mongering, okay? So what happened with the Mujahideen when they were fighting Afghanistan against the Russians? We funded them. We gave them tanks. We gave them money. We gave them guns to beat the Russians, right? Fast forward a few years later, or 10 years later, then the Mujahideen became the Taliban, and now we had to go over there and fight them, okay? So what are we seeing now? We're constantly funding Ukraine, who just absorbed all these regiments into their military, right? And who's to say in 10 years from now it won't be America and UK saying, you know what, these regiments grew over time. Now it's time that we have to go over there and denazify Ukraine. So essentially, when Putin says he wants to denazify Ukraine, it might be a lie to use that as an excuse to occupy Ukraine, but there are Nazis in Ukraine, and I'm pretty sure everyone agree that we need to denazify. If you disagree with that, let me know in the comments. Now, when I talked about how there was an agreement that could have ended the conflict, right? In May 2002, Russia and Ukraine had an agreement set in stone, ready to be signed, okay? It was a simple, a pretty simple, straightforward agreement that Russia would withdraw. I believe they would withdraw and occupy a certain part of Ukraine. Okay, there are two parts of Ukraine, the Donbass region and Crimea, that consider themselves still ethnic Russian. They still speak Russian there. They still fly the Russian flag. Crimea, actually, they had a referendum and voted to be absorbed back into Russia. Donbass, I believe, is still under Ukraine, but part of that deal was they would get one of those regions, and that Ukraine would not join NATO, and then the conflict would be over. Now, as those negotiations got closer to being secured, Boris Johnson from the UK flew to Ukraine and pressured Zelensky not to signing. Okay, so this conflict could have been over in May 2002, but the UK. Boris Johnson pressured Zelensky into not signing that agreement. Why? That's for you to think about. Why would he, regardless of the agreement details, why wouldn't we encourage Ukraine to accept that agreement and end the war? What could be worse than sitting in a war for a year? That's something that you could think about. And the last thing, guys, we're going to cover, okay, is the Wuhan lab leak. So I think this is really important to mention. A year ago, right, suggesting a lab leak was a radical conspiracy theory that you could be deplatformed and demonetized for. I might even get like a flag on my YouTube channel now for saying this, but this is in the news now. So the FBI has assessed that a leak from the laboratory in the central Chinese city of Wuhan likely caused the COVID pandemic. Okay, that's a quote from FBI Director Christopher Wray. Okay, so they're admitting that it's likely this wasn't from a bat, it wasn't from a snake, it wasn't from, whatever they were saying it's from. It's likely from a laboratory in Wuhan. Guys, most people already knew that. It was just frowned upon to talk about. Okay. Now think about this. This is the point I want to make about this. Was it created, right? Obviously it was created. Why was it created? Was it weaponized? Can it be more weaponized? Right? You talk about this lab leak, and then I want to talk about this article in the Associated Press if I can find it. This is old, but NPR, sorry, not Associated Press. So NPR reported that China, a Chinese company contacted several U.S. states and offered to set up testing labs. Okay, this is back in February 24th, 2001. Okay, so China, as a byproduct, the Chinese firm Beijing Genomics Institute would likely gain access to the DNA of those tested. This is something I talked about maybe on Facebook a while ago. And the fact that it was reported by NPR is, that's a pretty legitimate site. Basically, China was trying to buy DNA from those being tested on testing sites. Okay. Now, what would China do with DNA from testing sites? I don't know. Right? Like, you guys can think about that. They're creating viruses, trying to buy Americans' DNA. Once they have Americans' DNA, they can modify things and potentially make a a weaponized illness even stronger against whatever they see in the DNA. Guys, it's scary stuff, right? I know it's like it's easier to just be like, well, that's just like a scary conspiracy theory. That's fear mongering. This is like real stuff that you look up in the news. It's not fake stuff. So yeah, guys, I appreciate everyone sending in the links, right? I'll look through here if we have any comments on the live. If anyone has a comment, please put it in the live. Jose, I know I was going to talk about aliens, but I didn't really have a reference or a baseline to talk about that. But I am reading this book. It's called Gods of Eden, about basically the author studied world history. He was trying to write a book about the history of human war, and the more he studied, the more he leaned towards extraterrestrial intervention in human affairs. And the book is really good. About 200 pages in. It's like a 500-600 page book, but it's already have some pretty jaw-dropping claims that it makes. But the good thing is it has references and bibliography, and there are times that he's, postulating. It's not necessarily like based on fact, but there are times that he could pretty much put all the points together and into a line, which I appreciate. But I'll definitely think about giving that book a review. Yeah, if anyone has any questions or comments, you guys can drop them in the section. But next week we'll do another live, same time. Actually, next week I will be doing a live stream together with Gil Renchak from SOCA. He runs Black Belts of Long Island Instagram page, and we'll be doing a dual podcast. We have a match coming up this month, so we're going to do a podcast and see what we talk about. Other than that, guys, what did I want to say? Yesterday, Hampton's Jiu-Jitsu, we went to a wrist lock seminar with Eric from Holdfast. Thank you again, Eric. Everyone's been loving the stuff you showed. Real good class. And I believe that's all for this week. And then the next 3 weeks of March, guys, we have Sogi, TAP, LIJJN, and yeah, then we're into April. And then we have Rise. So busy couple months. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Like it, share it, comment, send it to your friends.